Hello everyone, today we talk about the 534 AD Battle of Mammes. So this major clash between the Romans and Berbers occurred in what is essentially modern-day Tunisia. It's an important battle here. We have the fortune, the lack of being well documented for the time. Today, in fact, we will essentially read pretty extensive passages from Procopius' History of the Wars from the fourth book. So part of the so-called Vandalic War. As here we have to give a bit of context for the battle. Essentially, between 533 534. General Belisarius had invaded and destroyed the Vandal Kingdom of Africa. I made a pretty hefty video on the history of the Vandals, so if you're interested to look at that a little bit more, that can be interesting. Actually, Procopius tells us enough about the same warfare that had gone on between the Vandals and the Moors in Africa in the previous years, and that is also very interesting. It doesn't add a huge much to what we need to know. Now, for the Battle of Mammes, maybe we will quote something, just a little, detail from Moorish customs and all from even from the book number 3. Of Procopius' work, but essentially it's more fascinating to understand the political, just in the military relations between the Vandals and the Moors before the Byzantine conquest of Africa. So there is a lot of debate relatively also to the strategical necessity of conquering Africa. From Constantinople, I made more than one video about the Justinian's reconquest. So this major military force to bring essentially the Western Mediterranean lands under the head of Constantinople, which it's been really criticized because because all these conquests were short-lived in a way or another. I'm a bit tendentially, I think that it wasn't a huge mistake. Actually, it was probably the only most intelligent thing to do at the time, and eventually history took other paths for other reasons, also environmental ones that couldn't be foreseen at this time. So I made this couple of videos. The first one is called Justinian's Reconquest, Illusion or Concreteness, and the other one, Justinian's Reconquest, a short history. So if you're interested about it, can fit with that. And for the Vandals, if you want the title, I think it was the Vandals, the Shining Wanderers of the Migration Era, because that's what Vandal etymologically means. And I don't discuss in there in detail the history of Vandalic Africa, telling the truth. I mean, I discuss about it extensively, but telling the truth, the clash between the Moors and the Vandals is a bit, it was a generalist video. I didn't get totally into it, but we can look at that maybe another day. So in this context is very important because that Roman Africa had been here. We are still in the late antique age. Let's say that what we call it as late antique society basically died out mostly later to the canonic beginning of the Middle Ages in 476 AD. So we're talking about relatively to Vandal Africa. We have to understand as this pretty, actually pretty good, pretty well off region of the Mediterranean at the time. Of course, a lot of, say, late antique culture was, late antique society was already declining. It wasn't so vital as it had been in previous times. That Africa, Roman Africa, that is today's roughly today is Tunisia and eastern Algeria, was this extremely fertile and consequently urbanized land of the Roman Empire. Some of the greatest scholars and thinkers of the late antique age, including St. Augustine, etc., came from this very intensely Romanized province of the empire. And it was strategically very important because Africa basically fed the Italian peninsula, that is, therefore, Rome and Ravenna, etc. So it was very important for the Byzantines to retake these lands. And the Roman Africa was, however, as basically most of the North African domains proper of the Roman Empire, pretty advanced, but usually only along the coasts. So the hinterland was obviously starting to be already semi-arid in some way, if not desertic, going far inland. And historically speaking, the regions, these hinterland regions, were inhabited by semi-nomadic populations that were called as, there were very ethnicities in here. Since we are up to now on a mostly medieval history channel, you often hear this name of the Moors. The Moors, it seems, it's a very stupid name, telling you. It's just saying the Saracens. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a name, I mean, from an ethnical point of view. It means a cluster of peoples that were defined like that, as a synecdoche, essentially. And the story of these populations were rather variegated. However, these populations were mostly Berber. Ethnically speaking, they were called Moors because of this. I don't know whether it's right to call it a tribe or a people that inhabited, in fact, what is today's Western Morocco and partly Mauritania, which takes the name from after that were named the Maori in Latin. So I don't know. These are all names that obviously the Roman had Latinized from other, from certain languages that in part are actually lost. I think the etymology of Maori is known. If you let me check, I can even tell you that what. I don't know. Honestly, the etymology. So Strabo calls them Mauroi. So here, no, I don't think we actually have an etymology of what the local name meant. So, however, Greeks and Romans had called them in this fashion. And by this time, this late antique migration era times, we often overlook North Africa, actually, because that was also an area into which the political equilibrium had been a bit shifted. In Roman times, Africa had been pretty easy to govern. It was actually pretty easy to, in fact, you see that there wasn't, as a matter of fact, a real border in the south of the empire. There were mostly these fences that were sometimes enough, together with scattered garrisons, to hold the raids of these populations. So we said before, these were mostly semi-nomadic. They were extremely skilled horsemen. So these were people specialized in hit-and-run tactics, skirmishing, and generally speaking, they were also pretty simple in the way they had relative primitive societies. They didn't have seemingly great social stratification. The greatest Berber kingdoms had been the ones of Numidia and Mauritania back in the day, and these were regions that had barely known urbanization in practice. There were certain major centers, like trade centers, if you take Cirta in Numidia or other, if you think about Tingis, just in front of Gibraltar Straits. So these areas that were at the center of certain important trade routes, but that weren't really cities as we imagined them in the Greek or the Roman world. Excuse me, I drink a little. Excuse me. So they had this semi-nomadic, typical semi-nomadic character. Excuse me, I'm turning Skype off once again, because once again I gotta receive messages, so excuse me for the inconvenience. These were tribes that lived pretty much scattered along these semi-desertic areas that in summer can get very, very hot, and in winter very, very cold, to be honest. Certain areas of North Africa, if you go into Morocco in vacations, there are certain places on the Atlas Mountains that look like Tyrol or Austria, because they objectively are this. So it was also a pretty varied climate, not anything. And there is a quote from Procopius here that I found, that is book 4, chapter 6. That said, it really tells it a bit how these populations lived. Naturally, consider here there is the Romans at this time were pretty keen on this ethnographical way of describing all the various peoples around, because that proved, by the way, in their historiography, how Rome, was still this ecumenic empire that basically encompassed so many areas, that all these differences were studied and known. So Procopius states, but the Moors live in stuffy huts, both in winter and in summer, and at every other time, never removing from them either because of snow or the heat of the sun, or any other discomfort whatever due to nature. And they sleep on the ground, the prosperous among them, if it should so happen, spreading a fleece under themselves. Moreover, it is not customary among them to change their clothing with the seasons, but they wear a thick cloak and a rough shirt at all times. And they have neither bread nor wine, nor any other good thing, but they take grain, either wheat or barley, and without boiling it or grinding it to flour a barley meal, they eat it in a manner not a whit different from that of animals. So, as you understand, this is pretty. This is a description of a very primitive society. Here, Procopius is stressing that the Romans liked, in fact, to. We think of the ancient world as this extremely developed place, even in Rome, in the Roman Empire, and in the Greek world, etc. But telling the truth, most of the peoples at the time lived in this primitive way, and you see how environment could really trace a sort of geography of the settlements. So in coastal Africa, you had this very advanced urban civilization. Then a few kilometers in the hinterland, you had essentially these populations. Well, not really a few kilometers, but it depends. It depends on the areas. Actually, Roman Tunisia was pretty fertile in its. I can't say in its entirety, but at least also a large area of the hinterland were pretty fertile. That's how, by the way, cities like Carthage had developed, historically speaking, because this was also partly this structural availability of resources. This happened in Cyrenaica a bit as well, but for instance, Libya was very different as other areas were, and so you really have to take into consideration the geography, the nature of the places to understand how this was. But let's say that these Moors didn't live pretty far away from the Roman civilization, and therefore had grown as this warring presence. As I was saying before, the Romans hadn't had a big deal of trouble at keeping these Berber peoples at bay during the empire. Now, during the migration era, these populations kind of set in motion a little bit because of the instability that had followed, for instance, with the Vandalic invasion of Africa, and their favorite strategy was about raids. As you understand here, Procopius' description is devastating. It basically pictures an extremely poor, materially poor and primitive people, which is pretty much how the Berbers were, really, and how they remained for a long time. And from a strictly military historical point of view, what is interesting about this is that, in fact, you see, the local warfare remained pretty much unchanged during the centuries. It might be, afterwards we will quote what Procopius said, but you have to think of the Berbers really being equipped with some javelin, a small shield, and nothing else. They were good riders, though. They rode horses, usually. Actually, the camels not existing before the Roman conquest, seemingly, because it was the Romans who brought camels into there from Asia, I suppose. But I should check that out as well. So even this stereotypical thing of that we have today of the Berbers riding camels and all, it's something that didn't exist at the time. And these guys were pretty much skilled horse riders. By the way, certain areas of North Africa had remained a bit like certain areas of Northern Europe, backwards in military tradition. In Libya back in the day, you could still find, for instance, war chariots, typical of this tribal societies and warfare, so that the chieftain would go, and the nobility to fight on this. For instance, the Garamantes made extensive use of these chariots. So when we talk about the Moors, we're actually talking about this ensemble of people. We're not really talking about the descendants of the Maori specifically. They were, relatively, contained area of Western Africa. We're talking about, at this time, the Moors was in fact a synecdoche, as I said before. They were all to define all these Berber populations that dwelled in there. It is true, though, that because of the instability caused by not just the Vandalic invasion of Roman Africa, but also of troubles ongoing in Roman Africa itself, there was also a lot of problems with the heresies, a lot of actually also a lot of warfare, and due to this raiding, I don't know if you ever heard about the Schwerpunkt. No, that's another thing. But whatever. Say that Roman Africa had lots of resources, and when it remained relatively unguarded, a lot of unrest started occurring in the area. So this basically brought to the weakness of Roman Africa that, as a cause of the same Vandalic invasion, and the Vandal kingdom wasn't this huge bad thing as it's called. Actually, there are a lot of pretty stupid prejudices towards the Vandals, as in fact Vandals. That is how we remember even them in the modern meaning of the word, but it wasn't a big deal of a stable country. At least the Vandals didn't obviously have the same level of advancement in administration, in style, culture, etc. So actually, Roman Africa, Vandalic Africa, suffered the attacks of the Berbers, who were exploiting the Vandalic weakness. And the Vandals were actually there were alternate fortunes in fighting the Berbers, and it had been tough for them. Now, when Belisarius conquered Vandalic Africa, the Byzantines reorganized the area, so they created this Praetorian Prefecture of Africa. However, the basically these territories had shrunk compared to the original, to the old Roman provinces in the area, because many lands that were encompassed by it were now had been occupied by these Berber tribes, collectively called Moors, in fact. So at this point, telling the truth, initially the Byzantine, the Moors kind of agreed with the Byzantines, as Belisarius apparently promised them to share with them the loot from the fallen Vandal kingdom. So this was kind of a way. We don't know excessively much about that period history, but you can understand what kind of motivations were behind this. First of all, having an allied, at least formally allied, in population around the Vandal kingdom would have contributed to put more pressure on the Vandals. These newly conquered areas now had to kind of pass in background because of the invasion of Ostrogothic Italy. That was the major campaign of the Justinian Reconquest. So basically, the Byzantines needed to have their backs covered, and they didn't want the Moors to be now so to be a trouble for them into Africa. Certain Vandals at this point, some of them had fled Africa after Byzantine conquest, but some of them actually, and the cream of the Vandalic army seemingly was integrated into the Byzantine army. There were Moors even into the Byzantine army at this time. During the Gothic Wars, there is evidence of that, of Moorish contingents fighting alongside this other very multi-ethnical Byzantine army that included Huns, Longobards, people from literally everywhere. This is a characteristics of the Byzantine army at this time, and not just at this time, naturally. Certain Vandals had been actually even settled at the borders of the newly reconquered Roman Africa to exactly form these garrisons, these bulwarks against the Moorish raids. But seemingly the instability that had followed the war, because Roman Africa, the Byzantines actually managed to keep Africa for 1 century, so essentially up to the Islamic invasions. So the Moors weren't this major strategic threat, like, I don't know, how the Persians could be, because these peoples, as semi-nomadic, but not completely nomadic, telling the truth, in certain cases, were not particularly versed into siege warfare. They could raid into Roman Africa, but they couldn't take cities because, by the way, they didn't know how to manage them, really. They had an even cultural limit for which it is typical of a completely nomadic societies, that they can't pillage a place but not having really the ability of. There is no comparison, for instance, with the Germans. The Germans that now were pretty much semi-nomadic, and they eventually sedentarized immediately. The Moors always remain, in this sense, pretty attached to their lifestyle. It's a bit like the Huns. The Huns couldn't do anything but basically exacting tributes for the Roman Empire, but they couldn't really manage a sedentary civilization, unlike the Germans. So we're talking about these differences that are important, because basically Roman Africa at this point could be harassed by these raids from the Moors, but not really fall into their hands, and it was pretty easy to defend fortified centers at this point from the Moors that didn't have, as far as I know, siege weaponry and all this stuff, and remain in this way. So what happened is that when Belisarius settled things into Africa and left for Sicily, he was succeeded in Africa by the Magister Militum Africae. So the master, the military commander of Africa, by his domesticus. These are all titles that are pretty typical of late Roman society. The domesticus would be a sort of chief of staff. Literally the one who lives in the house of whoever the commander is in this sense. This is also a name that remains also into the Latin Germanic Europe. For instance, the Major Domus, for instance, or these figures like that, and this so Belisarius' successor in Africa was this Solomon. Solomon was an eunuch. So it was from Dara, so from this area, actually from Mesopotamia. So this gives you a bit of an idea of what how multi-ethnic was the Eastern Roman Empire at this time. It's practiced to have eunuchs there. You see, even Narses, that eventually substituted Belisarius into Italy during the Gothic War. Why the eunuchs? Well, this was a normal practice of essentially for the Byzantine emperors to be sure that these guys wouldn't rebel, because in order to be raised to be an emperor, you had to be physically fit. So there was a big deal of these administrators that were actually castrated, so that they could grow to be extremely powerful individuals. In fact, if you take even Solomon here or Narses, these were pretty cool guys, telling the truth. Even, I don't know, maybe being castrated gives some sort of more reflective nature, behavior. I don't really know, but it was a pretty clever, say, even if obviously you can arguably debate on the on the ethical level where this was. Maybe not, but these guys were extremely powerful individuals, and also pretty effective administrators most of the times, and also military commanders, as you can understand, and how we will see with Solomon today for the Battle of Mammes. So as soon as Solomon kicked in, the tribes of the Moors living into Byzacena and Numidia basically revolted immediately. So Byzacena is this territory that would be roughly today's central and southern Tunisia. The Byzantium was this region that existed since the very first conquest of Africa by the Romans, so that Africa was actually the Romans had called Africa originally the world, roughly this large area of the world Tunisia and eastern Algeria. But sometimes the Roman provinces encompass also other smaller provinces, and after Diocletian's re-administration of the empire, you know that the provinces got were augmented and were on a smaller base. So the Byzantium that already existed was this lower side, basically south of Roman Africa. So in this area of Roman Africa remained the northern part of Tunisia, the most urbanized one. So this other area of the south that starts being pretty semi-desertic, but not desertic as well, and Numidia. So Numidia would be roughly today's Algeria. So this area of the hinterland that were, by the way, much less developed than Roman Africa, historically speaking. The Romans had conquered Numidia since the 2nd century BC, and they had extended even under Claudius, if I'm not wrong, into Mauritania proper. He had their domains, but these were mostly, there was a soft Roman government in there. It was mostly client states, Mauritania was a sort of a kingdom at the time. Numidia remained, with this local aristocracy. There was a deal of romanization. If you go to Algeria and Morocco, you can see still today extremely beautiful Roman cities that were exactly copies, with everything, with the forum, with the baths, even maybe in extremely small size, because these weren't huge cities. At least some of them. On the coasts you find big cities, but if you go into the hinterland, it's amazing that these areas at what at the time were conceived the very frontiers of the empire in the south, before the wilderness, Hic sunt leones, the famous phrase, here are the lions, because the Romans did, in the south of Africa, they didn't venture much into the African continent. They just say that here there are the lions. But they all had the tiny replica of Rome, basically, because this was at the base of the Roman colonization. So with this mall, with the curia, with the market, with the baths, with everything. And by the way, these populations had participated to, let's say, also to the imperial, some of the North Africans arose to be extremely effective. They were pretty eager to join, to get a Roman citizenship and to participate to the state. Even the Severi were Berber in origin. The Romans had this, and by the way, the Maori especially were were considered the best cavalrymen of the ancient world. At least this is what the Romans said, which is not entirely true in my opinion, because I think really the ones of the steppes were the best cavalrymen of the ancient world. But these guys were definitely impressive and amazing, and they were extensively used into as in the Roman numeri. That is, so these units of allies, especially as cavalrymen. So Moorish cavalry had always been there, and this is something actually very ancient, because as we said before, the local military warfare was pretty homogeneous, so that the Numidians and the Moors, for instance, fought pretty much in the same fashion. The Numidians had more, let's say, Mediterranean influences, in the sense that they kind of even tried to build a sort of strong strong is a big word for that, but let's say to emulate even the Roman legionnaires and stuff like that. But their traditional warfare was still about horse skirmishers, and you see that ever since the Second Punic War, the Romans used extensively, even in their campaigns, for instance in Macedon, all these Numidian troops, even elephants, but mostly these horse skirmishers, the Numidian jagulators, that were considered some of the best skirmishers in the world. And so this went on with the Moors eventually. And as we were saying before, it was throughout all the late antiquity, but also before, actually, also the early empire, there were always at times Moorish troops into the Roman army. They were pretty prized as cavalrymen, and so the revolt immediately occurs as soon as Belisarius flees. Now this is kind of meaningful, because naturally Belisarius Solomon had some forces into Africa. The bulk of the Byzantine army had sailed for Italy. So this is how normally things happen. As soon as there is a deterrent factor, everything remains cool and calm. And then eventually, as soon as the opportunities arise, they rebel. So there is a military episode that I think it's beautiful to talk about, because in the story Procopius makes it as sort of a unicum into the narrative. That is basically that the revolting Moors invaded the Byzacena and defeated the local Byzantine forces, killing some of the important commanders. like Gainas and Rufinus. So I would like to read now from the from Procopius, and I would like to find whether, let's say, if we can find, because excuse me a little for the inconvenience in here. So let's see what we can find. Okay, because basically this there had been a Roman contingent that had been slaughtered by the Moors at this point, and that's what eventually triggered the Solomon's response with the bulk of the Byzantine African forces at this time. And I can't find it now. Maybe it's this one. Okay, so I start reading from Procopius, book 4, chapter 10. Okay, here we go. So, and Solomon took over the army in Libya. So here we are essentially at when Belisarius had gone. But in view of the fact that the Moors had risen against him, as has been told previously, and that everything was in suspense, he was at loss how to treat the situation. For it was reported that the barbarians had destroyed the soldiers in Byzantium and Numidia, and that they were pillaging and plundering everything there. But what disturbed most of all both of him and all Carthage, so thinking here about the importance of Carthage as the main center of Africa, was the fate which befell Aegon and the Massagete and Rufinus the Thracian in Byzantium. So these were these Roman commanders. You see here, Aegon is a Massagete. So the Massagetes were and Rufinus a Thracian. So the Massagetes were these population that lived essentially in they were Iranic stock coming from the steppes. So this tells you in how in the Roman army at that point was, as we were saying before, multi-ethnic, and how these military commanders often came from areas that were still we can superficially Romanized in part, or that were even across the Roman border. It was typical at this time to have half barbarian commanders, and the Roman army at this time was this extremely powerful Romanization. Romanizer, we can say, for these populations, and this is important because part of these peoples, these people were pretty much warlike still. So they were good commanders also because they were more used to the local warfare. Was pretty intense compared to the more civilized, let's say, communities that lived more peacefully around the Mediterranean basin. So, for both were men of great repute, these commanders, both in the household of Belisarius and in the Roman army. One of them, Aegon, being among the spearmen of Belisarius, while the other, as the most courageous of all, was accustomed to carry the standard of the general in battle. Such an officer the Romans called bandifer. So this is basically the same etymology of banner. So it's from bandum and fero. So in Latin, this banner and carrier, bearer, essentially. Now at the time referred to, these two men were commanding detachments of cavalry in Byzantium, And when they saw the Moors plundering everything before them and making all the Libyans captives, they watched in a narrow pass with their followers for those who were escorting the booty, and killing them and took away all the captives. So what I find interesting about this is that Igon and Rufinus were actually two cavalry commanders. At the time, the Byzantine army was pretty much about cavalry. Were mostly mounted contingents. Actually, also Belisarius' army was mostly made up of cavalrymen. There was at least a very big ratio of them. And this happened for many reasons, partly of this migration era influence of horse riders, of horse riding peoples that had poured also as mercenaries into the Byzantine army, but there was also probably a strategical reason for having mounted troops and all. And it's interesting that these two commanders were put to essentially defend this area of Byzantium that is pretty external, so they knew they would have faced the Moors sooner or later with cavalrymen, since the Moors made extensive use of cavalry as well. So they had to have this very quick reacting force that could meet the Moorish cavalry in some fashion. So here it says, and when a report of this came to the commanders of the barbarians, Kutzinas and Esdilasas and Eurphotas, and the Medicinissas, who were not far away from this pass, they moved against them with their whole army in the late afternoon. And the Romans, being a very few men and shut off in a narrow place in the midst of many thousands, were not able to ward off their assailants. For wherever they might turn, they were always shot at from the rear. Then indeed Rufinus and Igon, with some few men, ran to the top of a rock which was near by, and from there defended themselves against the barbarians. Now, as long as they were using their bows, the enemy did not dare come directly to hand struggle with them, but they kept hurling their javelins among them. But when all the arrows of the Romans were now exhausted, the Moors closed with them, and they defended themselves with their swords as well as the circumstances permitted. But since they were overpowered by the multitude of the barbarians, Igon fell there with his whole body hacked to pieces, and Rufinus was seized by the enemy and led away. But straightway one of the commanders, Medicinissas, fearing lest he should escape and again make trouble for them, cut off his head, and taking it to shewed it to his wives, for it was a remarkable sight on account of extraordinary size of the head and the abundance of hair. And now, since the narration of the history has brought me to this point, it is necessary to tell from the very beginning whence the nations of the Moors came to Libya and how they settled here. Now here is making all a story, mixing everything with what the Bible says. So we're gonna skip about this and pass to the battle, but of Mammes, but proper. But I thought it was important to talk about this first encounter because it tells very interesting things from a military point of view. So here, basically, the Romans are choked in a difficult grain and narrow pass, and they're attacked by superior numbers of Moorish troops. So the Romans evidently were better in quality, as we've seen. These Moors wore basically no armor, they were all light skirmishers, and it was tough for them because it says from the Moors were attacking them from all sides. So in a way or another, javelins arrived from every side, from the rear. whichever position you took. This is important because it tells how basically the front of the formation is meant to work, even to fence off enemy javelins. So you can imagine also these kind of shield walls fencing from these javelins and sticking all together because of these assaults. Another thing that I found remarkable was the fact that basically the Moors didn't approach the Romans as long as they had arrows. Now the Romans at this time had pretty effective archery, mostly of composite bows coming from the east, and it's interesting because really, especially considering that the Moors were unarmored, that's probably why they feared Roman arrows so much. But even the fact that they didn't approach, if not for throwing javelins at the Romans until they didn't, let's say, exhaust the arrows, is interesting. Now here maybe Procopius is saying something a bit irrational, but theoretically arrows are, yeah, of course at a closer range they're more effective. So in order to throw a javelin, I think you can't, even with a propulsor or stuff like that. I don't know if the Moors were using that, but I mean you can't really throw these javelins at longer distances, at, I don't know, than 50 yards or more. I mean, even to have an effective hit. So I find still interesting that here the concept of how, what was the range of Roman arrows at this point, for making the Moors preferring to keep saying, however, the distance of javelin throw, because, well, this is just speculation, but I found it interesting. Also, the extreme violence that follows, we have read it. I don't think there is much to follow relatively to say relatively to this. The Romans, in order to defend themselves, they gather around this rock, this elevated rock, and they fight to the death, essentially. So there was this major defeat. I mean, not major, but definitely major in terms of that. Now the Moors were evidently enemies of the Romans in there, so that was nothing, and they had kind of messed up the situation. So now I keep going on, reading from the chapter 11. So now, when Solomon heard of what had befallen Rufinus and Igon, he made ready for war and wrote as follows to the commanders of the Moors. Now, here Procopius is making a bit of, of a historiography canon. He's basically, all these exchanges, even the speech. So it's interesting. However, we don't have to take it just as a literary topos, but it was normal also for the speeches of the leaders before the battle, of the two armies before the battle. This is something that recalls Thucydides and other stuff, but it's still interesting because it kind of he wants to tell us what really the actual point was for these people, and it's a quite interesting passage that now we read. So here Solomon, as the governor of Roman Africa, writes to the Moors, telling them essentially what the heck are you doing. So the letter says like this, according to Procopius: other men than you, Moors, have even before this had the ill fortune to lose their senses and to be destroyed, men who had no means of judging beforehand how their folly would turn out. But as for you, who have the example near at hand in your neighbors, the Vandals, what in the world has happened to you that you have decided to raise your hands against the great emperor and throw away your own security, and that too when you have given the most dread oaths in writing and have handed over your children as pledges to agreement? Is it that you have determined to make a kind of display of the fact that you have no consideration either for God or for good faith or for kinship itself, or safety, or for any other thing at all? And yet, if such is your practice in matters which concern the divine, in what ally do you put your trust in marching against the Emperor of the Romans? And if you are taking the field to the destruction of your children, what in the world is it in behalf of which you have decided to endanger yourself? But if any repentance has by now entered your hearts for what has already taken place, write to us, that we may satisfactorily arrange with you touching what has already been done. But if your madness has not yet abated, expect a Roman war, which will come upon you together with the oaths which you have violated, and the wrong which you are doing to your own children. So this is it's a terrifying letter telling. I mean, it's comforting because it's basically telling the Moors, look, people, what the hell are you? You know, did you go nuts? Did you exterminate a Roman contingent? Don't you think about the pacts that you have made? You don't think about the future of your children? Do you want really to fight against the Romans? Now this is important because here it says it beautifully, expect a Roman war. So not a war like the others, a war from the Romans. This is very, very important in understanding what the Romans really felt themselves like. I made a video that I also made, put in the channel's intro, that is about the Roman eagle and what basically the Romans thought about their own glory. Now at this time that was mostly a pagan thing, but even if now the Roman Empire was Christian, we know that the military ethos basically wasn't at all unchanged. And so this idea that, and on the contrary, now that was the army of God, because the Roman Empire was not a Christian empire at the time, it was the Christian empire at the time. So it was the ecumenic empire, and he rightfully says, Solomon rightfully says to the Moors, I mean, this is not explicitated, but it basically says you're a bunch of of barbarians living at the frontiers of the empire. What the hell do you think to go to war with the Romans? Are you nuts? So, so the Moors reply to Solomon. So Procopius goes on and says the Moorish response to Solomon. Belisarius, the Moors said, deluded us with great promises, and by this means persuaded us to become subjects of the Emperor Justinian. But the Romans, while giving us no share in any good thing, expected to have us, though pinched with hunger, as their friends and allies. Therefore it is more fitting that you should be called faithless than that the Moors should be. For the men who break treaties are not those who, when manifestly wronged, bring accusation against their neighbors and turn away from them, but those who expect to keep others in faithful alliance with them, and then to do them violence. And men make God their enemy, not when they march against others in order to recover their own possessions, but when they get themselves into danger of war by encroaching upon the possessions of others. And as for children, that will be your concern. We are not permitted to marry more than one wife, but with us, who have, it might be, 50 wives living with each of us, offspring of children can never fail. Now, this is a pretty bold answer. So the Moors weren't, they're saying very interesting thing. First of all, it says basically there are two things that are nice about, nice, that are interesting to point out. The first one is actually three, telling the truth. The first one is this personal bond with this or that, you know, here it says the Moors had almost basically accepted to be subjects of the empire. He says he persuaded us to become subjects of the emperor Justinian, but here it says that it was Belisarius who essentially deluded them. So it's you find this also in other barbarian peoples, that they didn't fully understand the concept of the Roman state as a public thing. It was mostly a personal bondage. Secondly, the fact that they stressed the fact that we're starving. Now, this is important because when you study the migration era, you realize that most of these populations that also fought against the Romans were doing that because they wanted to basically evade their poverty in some measure. So by raiding the Roman territories, by this idea of the resources, especially for these semi-nomadic peoples who were often in search of fertile land and all, was a very important thing. So he says, we are starving now and you have done nothing for us. This is basically the thing. Then the other exceptional things it says, that is an insult for the Romans, that he says, we basically don't care about our children. That is a very terrible thing to say, because we are not like you Romans that marry just one wife. We have even 50 wives, so it is a bit of a cocky attitude, because surely the ratio men-women in the Moorish population was 1 to 50. So this is a kind of, and obviously this is Procopius writing, so he wanted also to stress that he, ethnically speaking, this differences, to show the fact that these Moors had so many wives as a very corrupted custom, as a barbarian thing to do. So, but it says we never miss children. Now, our offspring of children can never fail. This is important because certain populations in the ancient world were a bit reasoning like this, like we are too many. We keep breeding, let's say, and so our race cannot be extirped in certain ways. This idea of the demic strength of a population was very important. This idea that this was typical, by the way, of these more primitive societies that, being less stratified and living also in dear conditions, paradoxically made more children than the others that could have a more rational, administration of essentially even of when to get married, with how many wealth for the family, etc. So this is interesting because now I didn't want to make politics, but coming from certain areas of the world, essentially also this one is of North Africa, there is a bit this kind of idea. People said, we will make lots of children so that we will, we will always grow as a population. One day we will. This has been said in a wholly different context, actually. But it's an idea that is rooted in some populations, and also the idea of, here the Romans were essentially threatening the Moors, saying, don't you think of your children? Don't you think the fate that they can have if so this is a concealed menace, essentially, by saying we will slaughter your entire race, and it's I think it's devastating. A concept like that your seed doesn't live on. And here it says, we are not like you more, let's say, Romans who marry only one woman. We have all the women we want. So it's kind of a pretty arrogant answer to that. Like, we will never make it to erase our race from the earth. So, I guess now we go to the Battle of Mammes proper after 1 hour of introduction, but I think it was worth it because it's pretty nice reading these things. Excuse me, I drink a little bit before we go on. So, Procopius said, so this is always chapter 11, and the whole battle of Mammes is actually told in this one. It's a pretty long chapter. So Procopius goes, when Solomon had read this letter, he decided to lead his whole army against the Moors. So after arranging matters in Carthage, he proceeded with all his troops to Byzantium, and when he reached the place which is called Mammes, where the 4 Moorish commanders, whom I have mentioned a little before, were encamped, he made a stockade for himself. Now there are lofty mountains there, and a level space near the foothills of the mountains, where the barbarians had made preparations for the battle and arranged their fighting order as follows. They formed a circle of their camels, just as in the previous narrative I have said Caban did, making the front about 12 deep. Now, stop a second. This is I think it's important to go back to see what Caban did, because this was a Moorish commander that had fought against the Vandals. And this is what he had done. He just made this circle of camels to counter the Vandals, and in that passage that is in book 3, chapter 9, we go to see how it was. So here, as I said, Caban is facing the Vandals, and says, Procopius writes, and Caban, upon learning this, that basically the Vandals were in the nearby, arranged for the encounter as follows. He marked off a circle in the plain where he was about to make his palisade, and placed his camels turned sideways in a circle as a protection for the camp, making his line fronting the enemy about 12 camels deep. Then he placed the children and the women and all those who were unfit for fighting together with their possessions in the middle, while he commanded the host of fighting men to stand between the feet of those animals, covering themselves with their shields. And since the phalanx of the Moors was of such a sort, the Vandals were at loss how to handle the situation, for they were neither good with the javelin nor with the bow, nor did they know how to go into battle on foot, but they were all horsemen, and used spears and swords for the most part, so that they were unable to do to the enemy any harm at a distance. And their horses, annoyed at the sight of the camels, refused absolutely to be driven against the enemy. And since the Moors, by hurling javelins in great numbers among them from their safe position, kept killing both their horses and men without difficulty, because they were a vast throng, they began to flee, and when the Moors came out against them, the most of them were destroyed, while some fell into the hands of the enemy, and an exceedingly small number from this army returned home. Such was the fortune which Thrasamundus suffered. So this was the Vandal king, I think, of the time, suffered at the hands of the Moors, and he died at a later time, having ruled over the Moors 27 years. So this is pretty cool. So we're gonna come back now to the Battle of Mammes, but basically Procopius is telling us that the Moors at the Battle of Mammes were deploying exactly how in that occasion. So this was basically this circle of concentric circles of camels, 12 ranks deep. So imagine to have all these camels placed in circle, in 12 circles. So he says that he placed the women and the children and the other people, so even old people presumably, that they couldn't fight in there, and obviously the fighting Berbers were placed within the among under the same camels, within the legs of the camels, hurling their javelins. And this was done because basically the enemy cavalry couldn't approach without being disturbed, without the horses being disturbed by the camels. This is something pretty well known into military history, the fact that horses get pretty nervous when they have camels around, and they don't want to go near them because they're frightened. And this is a very good way to hold cavalry. And in the meanwhile, the Moors were shooting with essentially throwing their javelins at the enemy, so that even the infantry couldn't come so easily at a close range. This is very, very interesting because it seems to have been the standard tactics of the Moors at the time, and if you think about it, it's pretty clever. So another important thing about this is that now the Moors were making extensive use of camels that were brought into the area by the Romans, so they found it eventually quite profitable to use it in such large numbers. That they were moving so also in here you'll find it often in migration areas, that these semi-nomadic populations were bringing with them all their women and children, which also recalls you what the Moors were telling about their offspring. So this idea that they were fighting all together as a functional society, by the way, because we will see now how the women and children even help at managing the camp, the weaponry, and etc. So it was a sort, from a military organization point of view, this is very fascinating, because it's as if the whole community was involved and organized to face these threats. And this is interesting because it shows you how even such a poor, primitive people could be so effective in military organizations, how human communities are able to find effective solutions with what they have, which is what human civilization is really about. And how many troubles they brought to the Romans. The Vandals were defeated by them on that occasion. And now the Romans find themselves into trouble because of that. So let's go on with what Procopius tells us. So, and they placed the women, here we go in fact with the point, with the children within the circle. For among the Moors it is customary to take also a few women with their children to battle. And these make the stockades and huts for them, and tend the horses skillfully, and have charge of the camels and the food. They also sharpen the iron weapons and take upon themselves many of the tasks in connection with the preparation for battle. So this is very, very interesting. It tells it all. This was extremely important manpower to make the whole camp going on, to even form the palisades, the stockades. This is important as well, because also these peoples were capable of making stockades, and stockades were sometimes very, very effective against, especially obviously in defense, against these populations. That's how the Romans had sort of kept them out from Roman Africa, by making these ditches and palisades all around the African hinterland. So we go on. And the men themselves took their stand on foot in between the legs of the camels. So once again, having shields and swords and small spears, which they are accustomed to hurl like javelins. This is also very important. You have to understand that basically in the ancient world, most, and not only of course, most of what you see as spears are, as a matter of fact, also working as javelins. And the wide majority of populations out there, aside from these major sedentary civilizations of the Near East, of the Mediterranean, etc., fought like that. I mean, even the Romans, originally speaking, fought like that as Italic warriors. They had these 2 javelins they used to make this hit and run tactics, and that's it. Then eventually it's just the state that changes the reality, but that was an exception. The whole rest of the world fought in that manner. Let's go on. And some of them, with their horses, remained quietly among the mountains. But Solomon disregarded 1/2 of the circle of the Moors, which was towards the mountain, placing no one there. For he feared lest the enemy on the mountain should come down, and those in the circle should turn about, and thus make the men drawn up there exposed to attack on both sides in the battle. But against the remainder of the circle he drew up his whole army, and since he saw the most of them frightened and without courage, on account of what had befallen Agan and Rufinus, and wishing to admonish them to be of good cheer, he spoke as follows. So before we read the speech, Solomon's speech to the Roman army, this last point is important, because he realizes basically that the Moors had deployed at the foothills of these mountains. So why this? Well, because in this way, first of all, they could deploy it in open field all their strength, but they could retreat in case of need up to the mountains, and in the mountains they had even this other, especially cavalry. So this was evidently a reserve that Solomon perfectly understands to be dangerous. So basically, from the side of the circle of the Moors facing the mountains, he doesn't deploy his troops, because he realizes that they could have got the cavalry, the Moorish cavalry reserves from the mountains could have fallen on the Roman soldiers where they were engaged into battle, to be taken from the rear. It was a pretty clever thing to do. So here Procopius gives us these extremely interesting speeches, both of the Roman commander and of the Moorish commanders. And this is a bit rhetorical, this is a bit cliche, but nevertheless the contents are very, very interesting, and they're surely very helpful to understand also much of their the respective not just condition of the armies at this point, but also certain military things, and also their mindset, if you want. So Solomon speaks to the Roman army and says, "Men who have campaigned with Belisarius, let no fear of these men enter your minds, and if Moors gathered to the number of 50,000 have already defeated 500 Romans, let not this stand for you as an example. But call to mind your own valor, and consider that while the Vandals defeated the Moors, you have become masters of the Vandals in war without any effort, and it is not right that those who have conquered the greater should be terrified before those who are inferior. Indeed, of all men, the Moorish nation seems to be the most poorly equipped for war's struggle, for the most of them have no armor at all, and those who have shields to hold before themselves have only small ones, which are not well made, and are not able to turn aside what strikes against them. And after they have thrown those 2 small spears, if they do not accomplish anything, they turn on their own accord to flight. So that it is possible for you, after guarding against the first attack of the barbarians, to win the victory with no trouble at all. But as to your equipment of arms, you see, of course, how great is the difference between it and that of your opponents. And apart from this, both valor and heart and strength of body and experience in war and confidence because you have already conquered all your enemies, all these advantages you have. But the Moors, being deprived of all these things, put their trust only in their own great throng. And it is easier for a few who are almost excellent prepared to conquer multitude of men not good at warfare than it is for the multitude to defeat them. For while the good soldier has his confidence in himself, the cowardly man generally finds that the very number of those arrayed with him produces a want of room that is full of peril. Furthermore, you are warranted in despising these camels, which cannot fight for the enemy, and when struck by your missiles will, in all probability, become the cause of considerable confusion and disorder among them. And the eagerness for battle, which the enemy has acquired on account of their former success, will be your ally in the fight. For daring, when it is kept commensurate with one's power, will perhaps be of some benefit even to those who make use of it. But when it exceeds one's power, it lands into danger. Bearing these things in mind and despising the enemy, observe silence and order. For by taking thought for these things, we shall win the victory over the disorder of the barbarians more easily and with less labor. Thus spoke Solomon. So this is a beautiful piece of literature, actually. It's extremely empowering as a pre-battle speech, and it says actually lots of things. I don't think it's now it's necessary to repeat them. But generally speaking, I mean, the idea here is that the Moors are not considered by the Byzantines as such a tough enemy. As a matter of fact, they think that they're pretty low quality, and they are right in terms of collective training and all. These were poor units, definitely. But it is nevertheless interesting, though, that also here the comparison with the fact that the Vandals at times had been able to defeat them. So here probably it adds a little bit also to the numbers of the Moors in terms of sources, because I couldn't find other numbers of the enemies but this 50,000 in here. That I don't think it's really telling that the army is 50,000, but and 50,000 is really too much also in organizational terms, so there were probably much less. And also the Byzantines were a few. Seemingly the forces here have been counted like 18,000 Romans and 50,000 Moors, but in all likelihood for the time these forces were probably much less. So I would say, even it's pure speculation, but I think that the Romans might have not more than some thousands, and the Moors might have been like in their tens of thousands, but definitely not 50,000, because an army of 50,000 is something you can manage only if you have a very great logistical organization, and I'm sure the Moors were good at that, but it's still a huge effort. They were numerous, surely many more than the Romans, but I doubt that they were absolutely 50,000. Because you have to think that even, sometimes we take the decline of the Roman Empire as something like, it was just about the Romans, and these other peoples were flourishing. But as a matter of fact, it is not so. Throughout all Eurasia and North Africa, this is a period of contraction, of seemingly of climatic problems, of this great eventually pandemic that would have arrived in Justinian times in a few years. But the seeds of the contraction of the economy and of the demographics was still there, was already there. Sorry, and these peoples that weren't particularly well off, and you've heard that before when the Moors respond to the Romans. They said essentially, we are starving. So they weren't faring excessively well, and that is credible. I repeat, these were pretty harsh times. The crop rate, or whatever criterion want to take to define the wealth of these societies was at a survival rate, economically speaking. So this is, they were that desperate, and the Romans here in the West were basically the only ones, aside from maybe some, I don't know, the Franks or some other major power now, like the Ostrogoths, etc., who could field, who had enough resources to field consistent armies, to have a functional logistics, and all. Because otherwise, this was not the case for the other peoples. So now let's pass to what Procopius says relatively to the commanders of the Moors. Now this is also interesting because Solomon, of course, in the Roman military hierarchy was the commander-in-chief, etc. The Moors seem to have been these essentially tribal groups. They had all their own commanders, all their own chiefs. So Procopius says, and the commanders of the Moors also, seeing the barbarians terrified at the orderly array of the Romans, and wishing to recall their hosts to confidence again, exhorted them in this wise: that the Romans have human bodies, the kind that yelled when struck with iron, we have been taught, O fellow soldiers, by those of them whom we have recently met. The best of them all, some of whom we have overwhelmed with our spears and killed, and the others we have seized and made our prisoners of war. And not only is this so, but it is now possible to see also that we boast great superiority over them in numbers. And furthermore, the struggle for us involves the very greatest things, either to be masters of all Libya, or to be slaves to these braggarts. It is therefore necessary for us to be in the highest degree brave men at the present time, for it is not expedient that those whose all is at stake should be other than exceedingly courageous, and it behoves us to despise the equipment of arms which the enemy have. For if they come on foot against us, they will not be able to move rapidly, but we will be worsted by the agility of the Moors, and their cavalry will be terrified, both by the sight of the camels and by the noise they make, which, rising above the general tumult of battle, will, in all likelihood, throw them into disorder. And if anyone, by taking into consideration the victory of the Romans over the Vandals, thinks them not to be withstood, he is mistaken in his judgment. For the scales of war are, in the nature of the case, turned by the valour of the commander or by fortune. And Belisarius, who was responsible for their gaining the mastery over the Vandals, has now, thanks to heaven, been removed out of our way. And besides, we too have many times conquered the Vandals and stripped them of their power, and have thus made the victory over them a more feasible and easier task for the Romans. And now we have reason to hope to conquer this enemy also if you shew yourself brave men in the struggle. So this Moorish speech is also very, very interesting. Then it says something very interesting relatively to the fact is the Romans have human bodies, as we have experienced recently when we killed them. This is kind of, this makes you understand how really the idea that the Romans were some kind of masters of the universe at this time. So were they even human? Are they a superior race or something like that? I mean, this was actually believed. Think about the this is ironic, naturally, because obviously they knew that the Romans were humans. But it's like when the conquistadores arrived into America, and when the natives didn't know whether these were deities or not, all covered in plate armor, on their horses, when they killed them, they went, and they noticed that they rotted like the others. So they kind of understood at the beginning that they were men, but initially they had thought they were deities. So you don't have to think of the Moors of this particularly, aware people of the, it's not really a matter of of course there were contacts and all. The Berber populations knew the Romans since more than 700 years at this point, so it's something. I mean, they knew what the Romans were, but still, the idea that these Romans were the conquerors of the world and that therefore they had to be something superior, or that, however, to which the gods had granted so many favor in practice, was something pretty alive and scary. Also in here, the same Moors look at the Roman equipment and are impressed. Actually, it says that the Moors were terrified, especially at the orderly array of the Romans. This is a typical thing. The Romans had this discipline and order. We've seen how Solomon asked the usual thing to the Roman soldiers to observe silence and order. There were a bit at this time actually the Roman army also had war cries and stuff like that, but probably they always had, also because of barbarian influence, etc. But they had a discipline no other people in the world had at the time, if not in China, or but at least in the West this was unknown. The Berbers were all these clans, and they didn't have any, they had a very poor collective order. So they were terrified by that in the first place, and that is, to see a Roman army deployed, it must have been a terrifying sight. And the Moors are concerned also of the equipment of the Romans. Now, the Romans at this time were also not extremely, sealing into riches, really. There was a lot of economy. We read from the same Persian wars that during the campaigns in Italy, both the Byzantines and the Goths actually had a very poor amount of iron armor, that they even had to build up sort of wood armor for their greaves and all. But still, so just only a small part of the Roman army at this point would be heavily armored. So here Procopius is kind of stressing the technologistical cliche of the fact that the Romans now had the best armor and all, and surely they had, but the Romans were not all equipped in that fashion. Simply they, however, had something that even included the Moors had never seen or were not used to. We have seen how the Moors were not equipped, if not with these javelins and small shields, and they didn't even wear armor. So even having a large shield, a spear, and a helmet is already something that would have impressed the Moorish fighter. So let's think about the heavier Roman cavalry or infantry with all these multi-layer armor of scale armor, lamellar armor, chain mails, etc. So it must have been a terrifying sight. Also, weaponry probably was something, these Moors were, I don't want to stress, the Berbers, actually we know, even archaeologically at times, that they, especially their elites had some sort of armor, even swords. In Mauritania there is, I think, extensive evidence of that, but obviously they were the ultra-elite, and even maybe the same Moorish elite at this point equated to have a sword or a helmet, for making you understand how materially poor they were. So you can imagine what the 6th century Byzantine army looked like instead. I haven't made a big deal of videos about them, but I will. In the next days I will make a video about the Byzantine cavalry tactics, especially. So you can understand the display of civilizations that the Romans were famous for, essentially in front of these barbaric peoples with a much lower degree of of organization. So here it basically also the Moors make a bit of those things like here there is no Belisarius anymore, so we're not against the conquerors of the Vandals but to other troops. These Romans are a bunch of braggarts. If we win this battle, we'll be masters of Libya, etc. So, and therefore be courageous. This is the emphasis. Be courageous. So keep up, because they were terrified. Seemingly the Moors, as always, the barbarians were much more terrified by the Romans than vice versa. So they had to find courage, essentially, to withstand the enemy. So of all these premise, the battle description is not extremely long. And it goes on like this. After the officers of the Moors had left this exhortation, they began the engagement. And at first, there arose great disorder into the Roman army. For their horses were offended by the noise made by the camels, and by the sight of them, and reared up and threw off their riders, and the most of them fled in complete disorder. In the meantime, the Moors were making sallies and hurling all the small spears which they had in their hands, thus causing the Roman army to be filled with tumult, and they were hitting them with their missiles, while they were unable either to defend themselves or to remain in position. But after this, Solomon, observing what was happening, leaped down from his horse himself first, and caused all the others to do the same. And when they had dismounted, he commanded the others to stand still, and holding their shields before them and receiving the missiles sent by the enemy, to remain in their position. But he himself, leading forward not less than 500 men, made an attack upon the other portion of the circle. These men he commanded to draw their swords and kill the camels which stood at the point. Then the Moors who were stationed there beat a hasty retreat, and the men under Solomon killed about 200 camels, and straightway, when the camels fell, the circle became accessible to the Romans. And they advanced on the run into the middle of the circle where the women of the Moors were sitting. Meanwhile the barbarians in consternation withdrew to the mountain which was close by, and as they fled in complete disorder, the Romans followed behind and killed them. And it is said that 10,000 of the Moors perished in this encounter, while all the women together with the children were made slaves. And the soldiers secured as booty all the camels which they had not killed. Thus the Romans with all their plunder went to Carthage to celebrate the festival triumph. So this is the battle. So what can we tell about this? Well, there are a couple of very interesting things. First of all, it's the Moors who actually begin the engagement. So this evidently was aimed at disordering, in fact, the Roman army, and succeeding actually in doing so. At this point, you have to understand that the Roman horses being out there and facing with these first attacks. So the horses were disturbed by the camels, as foreseen, and this is and therefore the cavalry basically get completely disordered, and most of them begin to flee even. So here it's not just the Moorish cavalry making these attacks, but also the light infantry throwing these javelins and causing further tumult within the Roman army. So the Romans are blocked a bit at this position, which is kind of normal, because when you have a pretty heavy army or at least an army that is based on this solidity of formation and relies on order, etc. These hit and run tactics of the enemy cannot be properly countered. I mean, the Romans were probably good at doing that, but the camels had basically eliminated that chance because the Roman horses couldn't attack now the Moors. So you have to imagine, I don't know, I imagine this as a sort of very thick interaction between Moorish cavalry and infantry. So basically creating an effect that is actually was pretty common at the time, that is basically hammering the enemy formation continuously. You have to imagine really the air being crossed continuously by darts of all sorts, and that is pretty difficult because that's a moment when you are vulnerable, because you have to protect yourself from the darts. You're agitated. You fear to be struck from a moment to another. It doesn't stop. That's also another thing. One thing is, to receive a bunch of volleys of arrows, and then, that's pretty tough as well. But this is continuous, like javelin after javelin. And javelins are not like, javelins are heavy projectiles, so they're meant even to strike through armor. And in this sense, you can argue that the Moorish warfare was also partly projected to deal with armored opponents, even though they were not armored at all, or almost at all. So that was, however, a bit when style kicks in, because the Moors, this happens very often in history, is that every army basically develops in a way that strengthens one point but weakens the other. So the Moors at this time, if they had a shock cavalry, let's suppose, they could have charged into the Romans and obtained something, but they didn't. So as just Solomon said in the speech, once that they have thrown those darts, that there is nothing much they can do if they haven't broken the enemy formation. So the Romans now were disordered and in trouble, but they stuck to. I mean, they were disciplined. They knew. Partly they had seen it all before. They knew what it was about. At least with our peoples, think of these Romans fighting in the eastern frontier against the Persian archers, that I can assure you they weren't less effective than these javelin darts. I made a video about an Sassanid army, an introduction. If you're interested, you can go for looking at the same period, more or less, this time on the eastern front, what was happening. So the Romans were this extremely versatile army that was good both at attack and defense. So this goes on. This Moorish harassment goes on and on. So at this point, the Roman cavalry seemingly is being knocked out, or at least part of it, of those who had engaged at close range the enemy. So Solomon at this point does one thing. Basically, he dismounts his horse. And he's immediately imitated by all the other cavalrymen. This is important. It tells you, by the way, how the commander here was was a figure pretty much involved into the fighting itself. Roman commanders were sometimes leading from the front, and especially during this migration era context. But also before, telling the truth, it was very important for what really the commander did. All the eyes of all the army were pointed at the at the commander. So even if Solomon was a eunuch, so you might think, but people didn't care. I mean, they thought actually he was seen as a, you have to think it here in the 6th century Byzantine mindset. That is not just a commander, it's a Roman commander. He's someone who knows his business, was being placed by there in the highest echelons of the state. So here, we don't know, Procopius might be exaggerating, but it's not plausible. It's not implausible that when Solomon dismounted, all the other cavalry dismounted as a sign of respect and of and taking that as an order. Especially even the situation is pretty difficult, and this is also interesting because usually the commanders like to stand on horseback to actually even be seen, to be at a higher level, so that people could actually look at him. Here, Solomon understood what was going on, and he decided, basically, in a way or another, to make all the cavalry dismount. And he ordered the others to stand still and to hold their shields before to receive the missiles of the enemy, which the Romans were probably already doing, and to remain in their position. But he himself starts leading these very few men. So he does very courageous. He leads from the front these 500 men against thousands of Moors, and he attacks in one portion of the circle. Now, this is pretty clever, because naturally you have to think this circle being we have seen how Solomon had deployed basically his army from one side of the circle. So you can argue that probably the Moors were concentrating their troops from that I don't know whether it was a demi-circle, I don't know, or just a narrower portion. Probably the Roman army wasn't. We have seen it wasn't that big, but at least I think it might have covered. Well, I don't know. Did the circle in diameter? I don't really know, but let's say that he attacks with this task force into a section of the Moorish circle. We don't know here what so this is kind of a desperate thing to do, telling the truth, because you're the commander. The cavalry has fled. You're basically throwing yourself with hundreds of men that are probably these were picked units to attack the circle proper. So what he does when they get there is to draw. He orders his soldiers to draw his swords and to kill the camels, the poor camels. And we're standing at that point, and to basically open a gap. And what is interesting about this, we have seen the Moors were counting on fighting from the legs, from behind the legs of the camels. And here says that the troops, the Moors that were there, are beaten, and they retreat. So here, you understand the superiority of this picked body of Romans. Or Roman swordsmen to assault in hand-to-hand combat. So the Moors were usually fleeing the enemy. This was the typical tactics of the Moors. They arrived close to the enemy, they threw javelins or other darts, and they fled. And their cavalry were extremely quick, so they retreated. Now, this was a different stand. This was essentially an infantry stand, because the camels were fixed and deployed in this fortress-like fashion, and there were footmen essentially there. So what the Romans these 500 Romans managed to do is to open a gap into the Moorish circle, and so they advance, and they arrived into the very core of the in the middle of the Moorish formation, where the women were sitting. And this was sorry, I skipped one important point. The Solomon had killed about 200 camels. So by opening this gap, actually here it doesn't say, but it's pretty obvious that the circle now was accessible to the whole army, I think. So the Romans advanced, so not probably just this 500 men led by Solomon, but also the other troops. So this is what usually picked bodies of troops do. They open a breach into a formation, and then the rest this breach is exploited by the numbers of the other troops that are usually lighter and not so elite as these picked bodies. Here it doesn't say it explicitly, but I think the sense generally is, in military logics, is this one. Figured the courage of doing something like this, but it's exactly this bold attitude probably the Moors didn't expect. So if you suck at melee, like the Moors did, that's obvious. You're trying to keep the enemy at distance with javelins. So what the Romans did here very cleverly was to send probably these heavier troops, picked body of troops that there were a few, but were enough to withstand the enemy javelins, putting the shields in front and advancing into there, and therefore doing what the Moors did not expect. So this is very important for morale as well, because to be bogged down and by these javelins and not being able to move, and you think about how nervous that makes you. You don't know what's going on. These javelins do not stop. So taking a stand and saying, okay, now we don't only stop in here and resist, but we even advance, is something that can give you to make you pass to the offensive. And that is something extremely reinvigorating from a morale point of view. It's very, very important that Solomon himself actually led this advance, because probably the fate of the whole army was at that point in his hands from that point of view. The Romans arrived in the center where the women were, and at this point, basically, I think once the Romans penetrated the circle, the Moors began to flee immediately, and they retreat. In fact, they withdrew to the mountains that were close by. So that's kind of a clever thing to do. But at this point, I think it was all a massive rout. Now we don't have evidence of Moorish troops making a last stand. Because usually every retreat in military history conceives some troops that kind of fight to the death, and probably there were also in here, but it was probably the average consistency of the Moorish army made this resistance to be very, very feeble. And the Romans follow up the Moors. So what is interesting about here is that the Romans followed them and killed lots of them, so that Procopius tells us that 10,000 of the Moors perished into the battle. So this is normal. Most of the death of a battle happened into the pursuit when the formation was broken. So this is kind of standard. The Moors were famous for being runners and to flee fast, but seemingly some of them were not mounted, or maybe even exhaustion can bring you to all these attrition factors that can make you slower even into the retreat. The Romans maybe were fresher. Think about these Moors having gone back and forth throwing these javelins. That's also physically exhausting. Now they were kind of specialized in doing that, but they're still human beings. They can't get tired. Doesn't matter if they don't have any armor. That doesn't weigh on them, or if their horses are conceived to be fast runners. Physics is physics. Second principle of the thermodynamics. You're gonna get the hell exhausted for that. And so what is interesting here is that such large numbers of Moors were taken, despite the Romans were on average heavier, and these guys were taken prisoners. Children and women were made slaves. So Solomon had got it right to think about to tell the Moors to think about the fate of their children. And as we said, 10,000 of the Moors were killed. It's nice that the Romans secured as booty all the camels that they had not killed. So that you have to imagine it to be also a very valuable resource in some measure, especially in such large numbers. So the Romans, with all their plunder, come back to Carthage to celebrate a triumph. So this is the Battle of Mammes, and what else can we say about this? Well, actually, it was a big defeat for the Moors, evidently. Then naturally we cannot fully know. I mean, this is just one source, and one source can tell whatever he wants. So we don't have to take everything as factual reality, because it isn't. We can obviously assess the plausibility of certain stories. This is a pretty military, logical narration, let's say, and it doesn't tell us anything surprising. Yeah, it's plausible. Both sides vote in the way they did, and that this is how the clash went. What is interesting more than this is that at a strategical level, this didn't stem the Moors. It's as if from the desert they could send others and others, and in this sense, the Moors were right at saying, we have many children, we will keep coming. And in fact, even after these very heavy defeat, the Moors are able to launch immediately other raids into Roman Africa. And we can imagine, of course, that even the same Moorish world was, in fact, it wasn't the Moors as a whole people. These were all tribes that essentially, if there are 1,000 tribes and you slaughter 20 of them, you slaughter 20 of them, and there are the other 80 that can attack and that are gonna fill the gaps by the way of those who have been slaughtered and seized their lands, so they can even maybe become even more well off than the others and field better armies and all. So this, actually, I'm not gonna get into the history of Roman Africa up to the Arab invasions at this point, but in this video at least. But it was extremely expensive for the Romans to maintain Africa, and it was it remained a sort of, up to the 7th century, a very militarized frontier, from which also certain, for instance, Heraclius, if I'm not wrong, rose from there. There were lots of rebellions of the local commanders also to attack Constantinople, which tells us, by the way, that Africa was still pretty wealthy at the time. It hadn't been gone destroyed. It was still a powerful land. And we know that Constantinople had to send troops either to crash these revolts or to stem to counter the Moorish raids. So that's also part of the criticism for the Romans having reconquered Africa, because some say you could have kept the Vandals there that weren't that big of a problem after they had been defeated by the Romans. They could have remained settled in there and handled the business of the Moors on their own. Instead, the Byzantines spent a whole lot of money and resources to keep Africa, and it's been argued that they could have been invested better, but there is a whole, the problem is we know really too few about such worlds in the first place. Historically speaking, it's difficult to actually see what the equilibrium really was. We can really go from an extreme to another and still being historically plausible. So even speculations in part are kind of useless, but nevertheless, it's a fortune we know what we know in the first place. What else can we say about this that I wanted to add? I don't really know. I think we can finish in here. I will be talking about the Moors sometimes more, because there is no really. It's what I would like to leave you with is to stress the simplicity of the Moorish tactics. I mean, not that were easy to carry out, because these were masters in horse fighting and all, but it's really the level of the plain simplicity of these. Almost the absence of social stratifications of these peoples, so that they all fought individually, practically in the same way. Whereas this, you don't find it much elsewhere, because even in the most depressed Northern European populations, there was a certain degree of at this time of social segmentation of sometimes they fought similarly to these other peoples, but it was a bit of a different story, and Europe was slowly transforming in other ways. Then naturally Europe had been Romanized in great part, so even the some of the of the infrastructures served. The Berbers remain essentially in this world of the desert that the Roman had not ventured in, and they had no reason to build anything there. So the Romans expanded only where there was a sedentary society that could be maintained for the technological standards of the time. Tunisia remained eventually during let's say a pole of civilization in some measure, because the environment allowed a stronger society to be created, but for European standards we're still pretty underdeveloped areas, especially after the Arab advance. But not because this is also cliche. I should have not told this, because I was thinking, for instance, during the 12th century, the Normans of Sicily had an very easy way to transform Tunisia into a client state. So these weren't excessively powerful areas, but let's say that Tunisia was a pole of always remain a sort of thing on its own. The Moroccans were another pole, the Egyptians were another, and Tunisia had eventually, also with the Aghlabids and other powers, its own kingdom, let's say, and this owes naturally a lot to the Carthaginians, to the Romans, to the fact that the local region had allowed a more stratified civilization to develop. So it was also, strategically speaking, Tunisia is projected towards the Mediterranean. Really, it's not like Libya, that is mostly it does have some centers on the coasts, but it remained always partly undetached, if not for Cyrenaica in part. So Tunisia is in this protrusion, let's say, into this Western Mediterranean towards Sicily, and it's naturally being used for launching raids, for instance, in there. That's what the Carthaginians do, that's what the Vandals did, that's what the Saracens did, all from Tunisia. So this naturally, you understand, is something that, first of all, you need resources to carry out. You need, and that makes you necessarily involved with the with Europe in a certain measure. So it's interesting to study also the relations that existed between the sedentaries and the semi-nomads in the area, because sometimes the differences were pretty big. Even if you see the Muslim powers during the Middle Ages were there, they had there was a pretty sharp difference between this, let's say, Arabized elites that lived in a sedentary world, so pretty westernized also in some measure, and these tribal levies taken from the hinterland that were essentially Bedouins, and these Berbers that remained in their lifestyle, also pretty similar to the one that existed since the ancient world. So it's interesting to see the kind of variegated nature of the local environments, and it would be a lot to tell about this, but now I'm tired and I've got to stop. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.